In the next section of this APA tutorial, we're really going to look at how to go from a reference that's on your reference page to actually citing that reference in the body of your paper. But before we actually talk about how do you format a direct quote or a paraphrase in a paragraph of your paper, I want to talk about taking good notes on your references, on the book you're reading or on the article that you're reading or on the podcast you're listening to, so that you set yourself up for success. And you speed up your writing process later when you want to format an APA. So I suggest when you're taking notes on any source that the first thing that you do is put the APA citation at the top of the paper. Just go ahead and format it. Put it in the right typeface and the right font and double space it and put the hanging indent in and make sure all the italics are in the good way, because it takes not that long to format an individual reference. But if you're suddenly facing at 11 o'clock at night 30 references that you need to format properly, that can take a while. Much better to do the work in advance when you're actually taking your notes, because now that I have this APA reference here at the top of my book notes, all I have to do when I realize that I want to use this reference in a paper is copy and paste this APA reference onto my reference page. That same sort of logic can really help you when you're taking notes as well, and you're taking notes on a direct quote or something you really think you're going to want to use. The next thing I would suggest when you're taking notes on a source is when you're done with all of your detailed notes, go back and write yourself a summary of that source at the top of your notes, right? So basically, I've written an abstract about Solnit's book in my own words about what I read and what kind of the key ideas are. This can really help you when you're working on paraphrasing citations and putting the sentences and ideas that you're synthesizing across sources into your APA paper later, because you may know when you're writing that you definitely read something, but you can't quite remember which source it showed up in, right? And you've left yourself a note to kind of look that up rather than having to read through all of your detailed notes, especially if you can't remember kind of which. You've read multiple authors that have talked about autism and neurodiversity. By reading your summaries, you can quickly maybe narrow in which notes you need to read in depth to kind of remember where you got that information, right? It's going to help you sort through multiple references and multiple sources of notes quickly on the fly. Other things that you can do that are really going to be helpful to you is as you're taking your notes, right, and you find a direct quote that you may want to use, right, later on, is to go ahead and format a parenthetical citation for that in your notes, right? So I've got this lovely direct quote here. I've got another here and here that I'm going to go ahead and put Solnit 2013, page 3, as if I was going to drop that direct quote straight into a paper that I was writing. This means that when you move it, when you copy and paste that into your draft later on, the citation is already done for you. And I do recommend that you put the author and the date, not just the page number, because here's what happens. If I had just put page 3 here, right, and there are a couple of other direct quotes I want to pull from my other notes, my notes on Wolcott or my notes on Sherry Marks's writing, right, if I've just put page 3 and page 30 and page 27 and I decide to direct quote all of them and I write 2 or 3 pages of text, suddenly I have these direct quotes that show up in my paper with just page numbers. And then I can't remember, or I might not be able to remember which author I pulled that direct quote from. And then I have to really go back and dig through the books and my notes to figure out who I need to actually cite. By writing in the citation now, it makes it a lot faster when I move them over to keep track of who I'm citing and who needs to go onto my references page or vice versa. You can also do something like this. When you're reading a lot of sources and you know that you're going to write a paper or an article or a book about them, it can be confusing sometimes to look back through your notes where you're not sure what was the thought of the author and what are your own notes on the thoughts of the author, right? You're starting to have your own ideas. You're starting to realize that the reading prompts connections across texts or sources. You're starting to know what you want to say and how you want to use a particular source. I often will leave myself a note. I'll open up a bracket, not a parentheses, and I'll put B. So I know that the next chunk of words are my thoughts. They're what I'm thinking about as I'm reading this source. And that can really give me an easy way to navigate through my notes and know what thoughts I need to paraphrase or what paraphrase thoughts I do need to cite and which ones were actually my own thoughts. That helps me just navigate and stay really deliberate about citing my sources. The other thing you might run across in books is something like this right here. Right. Solnit has cited Griswold in her book, right? So she had a parenthetical citation in her book where she said, Griswold said this, right? But I don't actually, she actually uses footnotes, but I don't actually have access to Griswold's work. But I really liked what he said. Resentment is a storytelling passion, right? We tell stories when we are resentful about something over and over again, usually to maintain some of our anger and resentment and work through it. But Solnit didn't say that, Griswold did. So the proper way to cite something like that in your notes is to just make a note. Solnit is cited this, so cited in Solnit. We can find this quote cited in Solnit. So that's how you kind of navigate that double layered citation in your notes. All right, by doing some of these things, you're going to save yourself some time and trouble when you're building your APA paper, when you're editing it, when you're building a reference page later. You want to work smarter, not harder here when you're taking notes, because you don't want to be sitting there editing a paper at 10 o'clock at night and realize you've got to track down Solnit's book because you can't remember who the publisher was. You don't want to have to go looking it up on Amazon or Google Scholar or digging through your bookshelves for the actual hard copy of the book. You don't want to have to look up all these publishers at 11 o'clock at night. You can eat up a lot of hours of time on the final edits, and that's really detailed-oriented edits that can be, they're not hard, but they are time-consuming, and they can be tiring if you're working on your second or third version of a paper late at night. So by taking good notes and taking good notes that set you up for success with APA, you're going to make writing an APA a lot easier later on.